In the late 1960s, a silent catastrophe unfolded in West Africa. A catastrophe so devastating, it would claim the lives of over 1 million people, most of them children. Villages once filled with laughter fell into silence. The air was heavy not with music or prayer, but with hunger, with grief, with the distant echo of warplanes overhead. It was a war that reshaped Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation. But it was also a war that reshaped the conscience of the world. Few outside Nigeria understood it. Fewer still remember it today. And yet, behind the silence lies a story of greed, of betrayal, of unimaginable suffering, and of resistance. Because this was not just a Nigerian tragedy. This was a global story of oil, of power, of empire, and ambition. A war fought not only in villages and forests, but in boardrooms, embassies, and newsrooms. A war where every decision, every silence, carried the weight of thousands of lives. For 3 years, the world watched images it had never seen before. Children reduced to skin and bone. Mothers holding lifeless babies in their arms. Aid planes flying through gunfire, risking everything to drop sacks of food into a besieged land. The world watched, and then, slowly, the world turned away. Why did this happen? Why was one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century so quickly forgotten? The answers lie in oil, in the fragile bonds of a young nation, and in the ambitions of global powers who saw opportunity in Nigeria's chaos. But above all, the answers lie in the voices of those who suffered and those who resisted. To understand how Nigeria descended into civil war, we must go back, not to the 1960s, but to the age of empire. Nigeria, as we know it today, was not born out of unity or consensus. It was created on paper, in colonial offices thousands of miles away, by men who had never walked its forests, its cities, or its riverbanks. In 1914, the British colonial administration merged 2 protectorates, the Northern and Southern Territories, into one political unit. To the British, this was efficient. To Nigerians, it was artificial. Suddenly, hundreds of ethnic groups, speaking over 500 languages, were bound together in a country that had never existed before. In the north lived the House of Fulani, predominantly Muslim, heirs to centuries of caliphates and emirates. In the west, the Yoruba, a people of bustling cities, complex spiritual traditions, and ancient kingdoms. In the east, the Igbo, ambitious, entrepreneurial, fiercely egalitarian. Alongside them, dozens of other ethnic groups with their own histories and loyalties. Different faiths, different customs, different visions of power, and now, forced under one flag. The British did not try to erase these differences. Instead, they managed them, sometimes by favoring one group over another, sometimes by turning neighbors into rivals. This was the essence of colonial rule: divide and govern. To the colonizers, Nigeria was not a nation. It was a resource, and at its heart was oil, the black gold that would one day ignite the world's hunger. In the lush wetlands of the Niger Delta, beneath the mangrove forests and fishing villages, lay vast reserves of crude oil. By the 1950s, the discoveries were impossible to ignore. The companies, Shell, BP, and others, swooped in. To the Nigerian elite, oil was the promise of riches. To villagers, it was intrusion, pollution, betrayal. Few realized then that this oil would become both the nation's blessing and its curse. On October 1st, 1960, Nigeria celebrated its independence. The British flag was lowered, and the green and white banner of a new nation was raised. Across Africa, Nigeria was hailed as the giant of the continent. A country of nearly 40 million people, rich in culture, rich in resources, rich in hope. But beneath the parades and the fireworks, cracks already threatened the young state. The question was not just whether Nigeria could govern itself, but whether it could stay united. Elections in the early 1960s exposed deep fault lines. Political parties were not truly national. They were regional, ethnic. The House of Fulani dominated the Northern People's Congress. The Yoruba rallied behind the Action Group. The Igbo, through the NCNC, sought influence in the East. Each group eyed the others with suspicion. Each feared being left behind. The dream of democracy quickly soured. Accusations of vote rigging spread. Corruption flourished. Riots erupted. The fragile union, only just born, was already straining under the weight of mistrust. And looming over all of this was oil. Oil revenues promised unimaginable wealth, but they also sharpened the stakes of power. Whoever controlled the government controlled the oil, and whoever controlled the oil controlled Nigeria. For many ordinary Nigerians, independence did not bring prosperity. The cities expanded, but poverty deepened in the countryside. Oil profits flowed upward into the hands of politicians, foreign companies, and military elites. Resentment grew, especially in the eastern region, where many felt their people carried the nation's wealth but reaped little of its rewards. The Igbo in particular had begun to see themselves as the backbone of modern Nigeria. Highly educated, ambitious, they filled universities, civil service posts, and business ventures. To some, this was a sign of progress. To others, especially in the north, it bred resentment. Whispers of rivalry and dominance spread. Old stereotypes hardened. The seeds of division grew deeper. By the mid-1960s, the promise of independence had begun to wither. Elections had turned violent. Coups brewed in secret. Regional pride outweighed national unity. And in the shadows, oil money fueled ambition and corruption in equal measure. The time bomb lit by colonial rule was ready to explode. By the mid-1960s, Nigeria was a nation on edge. Independence had promised unity and prosperity. Instead, it delivered corruption, rigged elections, and rising ethnic rivalries. Beneath the surface, anger boiled. And in January 1966, that anger erupted in the form of Nigeria's first military coup. The coup was led by a group of young majors in the Nigerian army, many of them Igbo. Their goal, they claimed, was to sweep away corrupt politicians and save the republic. But their actions would instead deepen the fractures of the young nation. In one bloody night, Nigeria's most senior leaders were executed. Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa, Ahmadu Bello, the powerful premier of the north, Samuel Akintola of the west. One by one they fell. The nation's political order was decapitated in hours. To many in the north, this was not a national revolution. It was an Igbo conspiracy. The fact that Igbo officers had carried out the coup, and that the most prominent victims were northern and western leaders, was not forgotten. The coup leaders themselves did not hold power for long. Within days, General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, an Igbo and the highest-ranking officer in the army, seized control as head of state. But his rule would be short, and his decisions fateful. Ironsi sought unity, but his decree to abolish Nigeria's federal system, placing more power in the central government, was seen by many Northerners as confirmation of their worst fears, that the Igbo intended to dominate Nigeria. In July 1966, just 6 months later, the backlash came. Northern officers struck back in a counter-coup. This time, Igbo soldiers and civilians were the targets. General Iransi was captured and executed, along with his host, a northern military governor. Power shifted north into the hands of a young officer, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon. The counter-coup unleashed a storm. Across the north, mobs took to the streets. Tens of thousands of Igbo civilians, ordinary men, women, children, were hunted down. Trains and lorries carrying Igbo families south became moving coffins. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 30,000 and 50,000 Igbos were massacred in just a few months. It was ethnic cleansing, a warning that Nigeria's fragile union was shattering. Hundreds of thousands of Igbo fled the north, pouring back into their ancestral homeland in the east. There, they found safety, solidarity, and a growing conviction that the Igbo people could no longer survive inside Nigeria. At the heart of this conviction stood one man, Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. Educated in Oxford, charismatic, ambitious, Ojukwu became the voice of a people who felt betrayed, hunted, abandoned by their country. In countless speeches, Ojukwu argued that the massacres of Igbos were proof that Nigeria was no longer safe for his people. He demanded true federalism, security guarantees, autonomy. But his warnings went unheeded. Throughout 1967, talks between Ojukwu and Gowon's government dragged on. Peace seemed possible, if only for a moment. At the Aburi Conference in Ghana, both sides appeared to agree on a looser federation. But back in Lagos, Gowon's government balked. The agreement was shelved. Trust collapsed. For Ojukwu, it was the final straw. On May 30th, 1967, he declared the independence of the Republic of Biafra. A new nation was born, a nation built from desperation, from grief, from the blood of the massacres. To its people, Biafra was hope, a chance to survive. To Nigeria's government, it was treason. The die was cast. Nigeria's fragile unity had shattered. Two flags now flew over the same land. And war was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The spark had been lit. And soon, the entire nation would be engulfed in fire. On May 30th, 1967, history shifted. With a single declaration, Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu announced the birth of a new nation, the Republic of Biafra. Its flag carried the rising sun, a symbol of hope, of rebirth, of a people determined to survive. For many Igbos and their neighbors in the eastern region, Biafra was more than politics. It was survival. After the massacres in the north, after the failure of negotiations, Biafra represented safety, dignity, a homeland carved from betrayal and blood. In those first days, optimism ran high. Biafra was small compared to Nigeria, but it was not insignificant. It held the oil-rich Niger Delta. It had universities, skilled professionals, a motivated army. Many believed that with determination and with international sympathy, Biafra could stand. But Nigeria's federal government, under Yakubu Gowon, saw Biafra's secession not as a cry for survival, but as rebellion. And rebellion would not be tolerated. On July 6, 1967, just weeks after Ojukwu's declaration, Nigeria struck back. Federal troops crossed into Biafra, launching the opening shots of what would become one of the most devastating wars in modern Africa. The war began with confidence on both sides. Gowan believed the conflict would last only weeks. A police action, he called it. But he underestimated the resolve of a people fighting for their very existence. The Biafrans were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from international trade. But they had ingenuity, determination, and the will to resist. What they lacked in equipment, they improvised. Scrap metal became armored vehicles. Workshops became weapons factories. In the face of overwhelming odds, Biafra prepared to fight. The early battles shocked Nigeria. In the Midwest, Biafran forces launched a daring offensive, pushing westward, capturing territory, and even threatening to march on Lagos itself. For a brief moment, it seemed the underdog might defy the giant. But Nigeria was vast. Its army, though shaken, regrouped, and it had the backing of foreign powers. Britain, desperate to protect its oil interests, supplied weapons and diplomatic cover. The Soviet Union, eager to extend its influence in Africa, sent tanks, planes, and artillery. Nigeria's federal forces grew stronger by the day. Biafra, meanwhile, found itself increasingly isolated. Few nations dared recognize it. Only Tanzania, Gabon, Ivory Coast, and Zambia extended official support. The rest of the world looked away, or worse, sided with Nigeria. By late 1967, the tide had turned. Nigerian troops pushed deeper into Biafra. Town after town fell. The oil fields of the Niger Delta slipped from Biafran control, and with every mile lost, Biafra's lifeline to the outside world grew thinner. What began as a struggle for dignity was now becoming a struggle for survival. Nigeria's strategy was not just to defeat Biafra on the battlefield, but to strangle it, to cut it off from food, medicine, and supplies until its people could fight no more. The optimism of independence faded. The rising sun dimmed. And as the blockade tightened, a new horror began to emerge, one that would define the war in the eyes of the world: famine. The war for Biafra was no longer just about guns and borders. It was about hunger, and hunger, weaponized, would become the deadliest force of all. By late 1967, Nigeria had a plan. It was not simply to defeat Biafra with bullets. It was to choke it, to cut it off from food, medicine, and trade until its people could no longer resist. This was more than a blockade. It was starvation, weaponized. The federal government announced what it called an economic blockade. In reality, it was a siege. Biafra's ports were sealed by the Nigerian Navy. Roads into the region were barricaded. Even relief supplies were intercepted. Nothing came in. Nothing went out. The effect was swift and merciless. Food disappeared first. Markets emptied. Cassava, yams, maize, all gone. Families survived on weeds, on leaves, on the faint hope that tomorrow might bring a sack of rice from nowhere. But tomorrow rarely did. By 1968, famine was no longer a threat. It was reality. Biafra was starving. The statistics are staggering. Over 1 million people would die, most of them children. But numbers cannot capture the silence of a village where no laughter remains. They cannot capture the cry of a mother holding her child as life slips away. They cannot capture the sound of thousands of stomachs, empty, for days. In Biafra, famine was not a side effect of war. It was the weapon. Nigerian leaders knew that starving a people could break their will to fight. And so, hunger became a strategy. Ojukwu called it genocide. Gowan called it necessary. The world called it complicated. And while leaders debated, children died. But the blockade had an unintended consequence. For the first time, Images of famine were broadcast daily to the outside world. Journalists smuggled photographs out of Biafra, photographs that shocked Western audiences. Skeletal children with swollen stomachs, mothers too weak to stand. These images pierced living rooms in London, Paris, Washington, New York, and they could not be unseen. For the first time in modern history, the world was confronted, night after night, with images of mass starvation. The war in Nigeria, once ignored, became a moral crisis on television screens, and with it came an unprecedented wave of humanitarian response. Church groups, charities, and private citizens across Europe and America mobilized. Airlifts of food and medicine were organized. Volunteers risked their lives, flying at night in old cargo planes, dodging gunfire, to deliver supplies into besieged Biafra. These flights became legendary. The Biafran airlift, one of the largest humanitarian operations since World War II. But for every plane that landed, thousands more went without food. Relief was heroic, but never enough. The blockade held. The famine deepened. The images of Biafra's starving children did more than stir sympathy. They changed humanitarianism itself. Doctors Without Borders, the now world-famous medical relief organization, was born out of frustration with the world's silence during Biafra. Aid, once seen as charity, became activism. Biafra's famine was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point. But for those inside the blockade, that was little comfort. Day by day, hour by hour, starvation claimed lives. And still, the bombs fell. Because famine was not the only weapon. Nigerian planes bombed markets, villages, and hospitals. Civilians bore the brunt of the war. And to the rest of the world, the question was clear. Was this war, or was it genocide? The world argued. And while it argued, Biafra starved. By 1969, the rising sun of Biafra had dimmed to a shadow. What had begun as a fight for independence was now a daily struggle against hunger, against despair, against extinction. While children in Biafra wasted away, in London, Moscow, Washington, and Paris, another battle was being fought. Not with bullets, but with contracts, weapons, and oil barrels. Because behind Nigeria's civil war lay something the world could not ignore: oil. The eastern region, the heart of Biafra, was home to vast oil reserves, reserves coveted by Shell BP, by French interests, by global markets. In the 1960s, oil was the lifeblood of economies, and whoever controlled Biafra's oil fields would hold immense power. For Britain, the choice was simple. As Nigeria's former colonial master, Britain had left behind deep economic ties. Shell BP, its prize company, pumped oil from the Delta. The survival of Nigeria meant the survival of British interests. So Britain armed Gowan's government, supplied weapons, and ensured diplomatic cover. Every bullet fired into Biafra carried a shadow of British policy. Every bomb that fell on a village carried the weight of British silence. But Britain was not alone. The Soviet Union, eager to expand its influence in Africa, saw in Nigeria a strategic ally. Soviet cargo planes delivered tanks, MiG fighter jets, artillery, transforming Nigeria's military almost overnight. In Biafra's skies, Soviet pilots flew missions. The Cold War had reached the Niger Delta. The irony was stark. Nigeria, once a British colony, was now armed by both London and Moscow. East and West, capitalist and communist, found common cause when oil was on the table. Biafra, meanwhile, had few friends. France offered covert support, not out of pure sympathy, but to weaken British influence in West Africa. Small nations like Ivory Coast, Tanzania, and Gabon recognized Biafra, but their voices carried little weight. For most of the world, Nigeria's unity mattered more than Biafra's survival. And then there was America. The United States, led by Lyndon Johnson, chose silence. The Vietnam War consumed Washington's attention. Nigeria was simply too important, too oil-rich, to risk offending. American oil companies, like Gulf, eyed Nigeria's reserves hungrily. Humanitarian aid would be allowed, yes. But political recognition for Biafra? Never. To the great powers, the war in Biafra was not about justice or famine or survival. It was about interests, about oil, about influence. And in that calculus, 1 million dead was the acceptable cost of stability. Perhaps the cruelest truth of Biafra's war is this: it was never truly forgotten. In the halls of power, it was never ignored. Decisions were made every day, weapons shipped every week, deals signed every month. The world remembered, just not in the way Biafrans hoped. And so, Biafra stood alone, starving, bombed, besieged. Its leaders begged for recognition, for allies, for relief. But the world answered with excuses, with indifference, with oil tankers gliding silently across the sea. For Britain, for the Soviets, for the Americans, the Nigerian Civil War was a matter of geopolitics. For Biafra, it was life and death. By 1969, the dream of Biafra was fading. The blockade had tightened. The oil fields were lost. The airstrips that once received relief flights were bombed. Every road into Biafra was sealed. Hunger had hollowed out an entire nation. The Biafran army, brave but exhausted, was collapsing. Malnourished soldiers fought with dwindling weapons. Civilians fled deeper into the shrinking territory. Whole towns were reduced to rubble. And yet, even as death closed in, many refused to surrender. In the final months, desperation turned to despair. Children too weak to stand lay in silent hospitals. Mothers dug shallow graves with their bare hands. The land itself seemed broken, stripped of food, stripped of hope. And then the end came swiftly. On January 12, 1970, Biafra surrendered. The war was over. Colonel Ojukwu fled into exile. His deputy, Philip Effiong, announced the end of resistance. After 3 years of suffering, the Republic of Biafra ceased to exist. Over 1 million people, most of them children, were dead. Villages destroyed. Families shattered. A generation marked forever. For Nigeria, it was a victory. For Biafra, it was survival denied. But victory did not mean healing. Gowan declared a policy of no victor, no vanquished. In theory, it was reconciliation. In reality, scars ran deep. The Igbos, once dominant in commerce and politics, returned to ruined homes, to confiscated businesses, to suspicion that never truly faded. Nigeria survived as one nation, but the unity came at a cost, a silence imposed on history. For decades, the Biafran War was spoken of only in whispers. In classrooms, in public discourse, it was a ghost, acknowledged but rarely confronted, a wound covered but never healed. And yet, the echoes remain. In the mistrust between regions, in the calls for secession that still flare in Nigerian politics, in the memories of a people who lost not only a war, but their children, their homes, their sense of safety. For the world, the war faded. The images of famine, once nightly news, disappeared from screens. Oil flowed again. Superpowers moved on. But for those who lived through it, the war never truly ended. Its ghosts walk quietly through Nigeria to this day. The Biafran War was not just a Nigerian story. It was a human story, a story of how power can blind the world to suffering, a story of how famine can be turned into a weapon, a story of survival against impossible odds. And perhaps most of all, it is a reminder that silence, too, kills.
If this story touched you, remember, what happened in Nigeria is not just African history. It is human history. And there are so many more hidden stories like this, stories of struggle, resilience, and hope that the world has forgotten. By subscribing, liking, and commenting, you help bring these voices back into the light. You help ensure they are never forgotten again. Join this journey, because the past has more to say to us today than we realize. And the next untold story is already waiting for you.